Welcome to the Dionysus Circle podcast. I'm Dr. Sam Bennett, your host. On this podcast, we explore the Eastern Christian fathers and the philosophical traditions that influence them, including figures like Plato and Aristotle. In today's episode, my co-host Jack Bozar and I talk with Dr. Elizabeth Yellenik, chair of the philosophy department at Christopher Newport University. Dr. Yellenik specializes in the natural philosophy of Plato, and we'll be discussing her recent article, Explanation in the Phaedo, an argument against the metaphysical interpretation of the Clever Αιτία. The Phaedo presents Socrates in a philosophical conversation on his deathbed, culminating in his drinking poison as part of his capital punishment by the state. This remarkable dialogue centers on 4 arguments about the immortality of the soul. Today's episode is part of a series we are dedicating to the Phaedo. And special thanks to Peter Anthony Tagni for allowing us to feature his rendition of the hymn Of the Father's Love Begotten from his album Sea Dreams. God bless you, and I hope you enjoy the podcast. So thanks for joining us, Betsy.
Thank you very much for having me.
Just to get started, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about yourself. I'm always curious, how did a philosopher get into philosophy? Was it your time at undergrad, or maybe it happened even earlier?
Yeah, so it's actually an interesting story. My grandparents were German Jews, and they had escaped Nazi Germany in January of 1939. And my grandfather was a philosopher by avocation, not a professor officially, but he just consumed philosophy all the time. And I was always taught that what saved their lives was the fact that my grandfather got a hold of foreign newspapers, and because the media was controlled by the government. This was maybe 1938 when they were just thinking about this. So the media was censored. But his doctor told him to go to Czechoslovakia for these mineral springs to cure his gallbladder problems, right? So they had an excuse to leave Germany. They went to Czechoslovakia. There, my grandfather read the foreign newspapers, and he read Mein Kampf. You and I know, philosophers know, that analytical reading is such an important skill. It teaches you how to anticipate arguments, how to defend your own views, and it also teaches you how to confront views that maybe conflict with your own. Mm-hmm. So it's critical reading, and so he had those philosophical skills with him, and the story was always that it was his reading of these. It was for philosophical reasons that he left Germany, but it was because he was able to read, and he had the training to do that from his background as a philosopher.
Wow, fascinating. So from there, I'd be curious, in terms of your scholarship with Plato, do you consider him to be, do you kind of mainly study him because of he's such a significant historical figure? He tells you a lot about the history of philosophy, or do you study him, do you find him compelling today?
A little bit of both. So I can tell you a funny story about why I chose Plato in particular, if you want to.
Yeah, sure. That. Absolutely. Yeah.
So I was in 7th grade, and elections for the president of the student council were taking place. And I was a straight A student and a huge nerd. I had these pink googly-eyed glasses, braces, and this was in the early 90s in New Jersey. So it was the era of big hair. I mean, Aquanet sales were through the roof. So the student who was running was super popular, and she had huge hair. I mean, she just knew how to tease that hair. And she campaigned on things that she knew people wanted to hear. Like, let's play, top 40s music during homeroom. That has nothing to do with school, right?
Yeah.
So I decided she wasn't qualified. So I decided I should run. So, of course, I had these pencils made, and my campaign slogan was, Betsy is your best bet. and it was printed on these pencils that I handed out. Because my whole thing was that I'm a straight A student. That shouldn't the most intelligent person or be the leader,
Having
right?
read the Republic, yeah, right. Sorry,
Right.
continue.
So I lost the election. I mean, I think the only people who voted for me were my 3 friends, and it's because my mom told their mom, "Please vote for Betsy." So I lost, and I wasn't so when I came home, I wasn't so upset about my own loss. I said, "Mom and Dad, our democracy is doomed. Shouldn't the smartest person win instead of the person with the biggest hair?" And it was a teachable moment. And then I read Plato's Republic, and I thought, yes, philosopher kings, absolutely.
Yeah. Nice. So the philosopher king idea got you. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of Plato's relevance today, what the first thing that comes to my mind is that concept that the philosophers need to be compelled to rule. The ignorant people who don't know anything about ruling, I'm thinking of the ship of state analogy in the Republic. The people who are ignorant are really eager to rule, and they don't know what they're doing, and because of that, they're the most dangerous. So, and another aspect of Plato that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of its relevance for today. So, you know how in the Gorgias, Socrates is talking about what makes for a good ship pilot.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the goal as a pilot is to get your passengers safely from one destination to the other. So that presumably would include saving your passenger from drowning. So that's what would make you a good ship pilot, because you're performing your function well. But Socrates raises the point, well, is it good that you saved that person from drowning? Was that a good thing? I mean, maybe that person was evil and dangerous and you should have let him drown. Right? And so what that reminds me of is this idea with artificial intelligence, just here, now, we have to confront it.
Mm-hmm.
You might be really good. Scientists are really good at using artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is really good at what it does. But do we know when it's appropriate to use it and when it's not? So that distinction between, a functional good and a moral good is something that I think is very relevant today.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, though, before we talk about your article, what do you think about Plato's sort of metaphysics? Are you more, I mean, obviously this article is heavily metaphysical, but are you persuaded at all that his metaphysical system is plausible?
I think I'm a Platonist about mathematics.
Okay, yeah.
But I mean, there are problems, internal problems with his theory of forms.
Well, that's a perfect segue into the article then. I mean, could you give us, for the listeners, maybe the 10,000-foot view, what you're trying to do, and I guess maybe why the article you thought was worth writing?
In the article, I'm examining Plato's account of explanation, the nature of explanation, what makes for a good explanation or a legitimate explanation. The reason that that's important to look at is because Aristotle famously criticizes Plato for attributing efficient causality to his forms in the Phaedo. And of course, that's absurd, because forms are eternal, unmoving, ontologically separate from this world. So Aristotle has this beautifully developed theory of explanation. And he just makes fun of Plato for just not knowing what he's doing when it comes to explanation. Plato just doesn't know what he's talking about. So is that true? I don't think Plato has the same theory of explanation that Aristotle has, but was he as bad as Aristotle made him sound? So that's what originally inspired the article, because now I'm looking at his theory of explanation in the Phaedo, and is the theory of forms enough? Is it sufficient for explaining the kinds of things that Socrates needs to establish in the Phaedo? Because if it's not, then that has interesting implications for what types of explanatory modes Plato has at his disposal in his philosophy.
You basically present how there's like kind of three types of explanation that are considered in the Phaedo, and specifically this appears in the intellectual autobiography. So this is obviously a very famous portion of the Phaedo where Socrates kind of gives a little bit of an autobiography of himself. How it comes up, I guess it's like Cebes is kind of like, hey, Socrates, you haven't really proven that the soul is immortal, which is kind of the main topic of the whole dialogue. Cebes says, hey, you haven't really proven it. And then Socrates kind of takes a long, dramatic pause, I guess. And he says, okay, we're going to have to, I'm going to have to tell you about my experiences, I'll give you an account of some of my life. And then he gets into, his autobiography.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up kind of contrasting, it seems like, three different kinds of explanation, right? And the first one, as you explain in your article, is like a more commonplace natural scientific explanation. The second one occurs after Socrates does a second sailing, which has to do with the theory of forms. And then the third one is the clever explanation that is really what your article is really kind of focused on. Could you maybe describe for us, like, what's motivating Socrates? Like, I'm kind of curious, can you kind of describe for us, what kind of is the question that's motivating Socrates at the beginning of this autobiography?
He's looking into the question of living things coming into being, existing, and decaying, dying. Now, his theory of forms, just to jump ahead and then for perspective, his theory of forms, if something participates in a form, if it either is, if I participate in the form F, either I am F or I have a characteristic F. I have the property, of F. Now, for living things, when you come into being, that could either mean that you come into existence or that you come to acquire an attribute, right? And for living things, coming into existence just is the same as acquiring an attribute. You're now living. So I think the reason he starts with that question is because the final proof for the immortality of the soul, he needs to establish that the soul has this attribute in a certain kind of way such that it will be immortal.
Okay, yeah, because I mean, if it has it in the way of like it's eternally alive, or once it's alive, it cannot possibly die. If it has life in that sense, then it's going to follow that it's immortal. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point. So the final proof for the immortality of the soul has this twist towards the end where he says the soul will never admit death, and things that are deathless are indestructible and therefore immortal. Now, he makes some comment along the lines of, everybody knows that the deathless is immortal. But that's an interesting way of going about the proof, because fire, or let's use a person, for example. They can be hot and then they can be cold. You know what I mean? Like, these things can change, but the soul possesses life in such a way that it will always bring life, and that life will never be destroyed.
Yeah, it's puzzling, right? Because like you said, you can think of things that it's alive, like
like a
but
plant.
maybe right, but maybe it can. I mean, maybe it can lose that quality. But
Right.
anyway, we'll kind of get touch on the final proof further below. So he has this initial question. He seems to be concerned with understanding, why things are generated, maybe why living things come to be. And famously, in his autobiography, the first sort of explanation he gets involved in is a kind of commonplace type of explanation. It's one you might associate with the pre-Socratic natural philosophers, or more generally with natural science. So can you kind of just tell us a little bit about this first kind of explanation that Socrates gets interested in, and then why he ends up considering it inadequate?
I think one important detail to point out in his discussion of the pre-Socratic natural philosophers and their scientific explanations is his discussion of the works of Anaxagoras. He so Anaxagoras talks about nous or intelligence, and so Socrates says, I thought he would, Anaxagoras would say that nous is responsible for everything, that intelligence is responsible for everything, and that the earth is spherical because it's best for the earth to be that way, right? And then Socrates says, and I was so excited, but then my hopes were dashed when Anaxagoras didn't make use of intelligence at all, and instead he cited air, ether, and these other things as the causes of phenomena. And that's not a cause. That's as absurd as saying that my bones and sinews caused me to sit, to be in this jail cell. So what I want to point out about that is that a couple of things. So the explanation that Socrates really wants is what I would call a Platonic teleological explanation, just to differentiate it from Aristotle's teleology. A Platonic teleological explanation, because intelligent agents always do what they think is best. And the degree to which that thing actually is good is directly proportional to the degree to which that the agent is intelligent. So gods are supremely intelligent, so everything that they do will necessarily be the best. Why am I pointing that out? Well, because notice that in that explanation, the idea, the thing, or the God in this case, is a cause that will guarantee a certain result by virtue of that thing's essential nature, right? So the essential nature of a God is that he's supremely intelligent. And so we're guaranteed that every time the God acts, it will be for what he judges to be best. And that's relevant to the other types of explanations that Socrates considers. So he has this funny passage where he says, it's absurd to say that Simmias is taller than Cebes by a head, because he's also shorter, than Simmias is also shorter than Socrates by a head. So how could one thing, a head, be the cause of something large and something small? So, but notice that with a head, there's nothing about the essential nature of a head that guarantees tallness. So I think his discussion, his rejection of the natural philosophers stems from his insistence that a true idea, a genuine idea, should cite as the cause something that guarantees the effect by virtue of the cause's essential nature. And none of the explanations that he explores during his intellectual autobiography fit that description.
Okay. So to be a genuine cause, is it like two parts to that? Are you saying like to be a genuine cause, One, it needs to guarantee the effect. In other words, when you have that cause, that's necessary and sufficient for the effect. So one, there needs to be a kind of guarantee relationship, right? And that lacks in the head, right? I have a head. I have a head, or I'm not sure how to put it, but like I have a head, but that doesn't make me taller than Shaquille O'Neal. Is that the
Right.
kind of point? Okay. All
Exactly.
right. So just having a head doesn't guarantee that I'm taller than Shaq. Okay. So anyway, so the first part is that the genuine cause, it needs to be necessary and sufficient for the effect. And then also, are you saying there's like this extra element, which is that it has to relate to the essential nature of the genuine cause? Is that like a kind of a second element, or?
Yeah, I would say so because ultimately, the soul, by virtue of its essential nature, namely bringing life, guarantees that it will enliven the body it occupies.
Right. So this is looking forward to the final proof where, okay, but yeah, so just okay, so the soul by its essential, so it's going to enliven the body when it's there, and not only is that effect guaranteed, but it's by its the nature of the soul that it's bringing about that effect. Okay.
Exactly, yeah.
So I mean, it's kind of, so we're trying to set up these three different types of explanations you talk about. The first is this more commonplace one. The second is the after the second sailing, we get Socrates talking about using forms to explain things, and then the third one is the more clever explanation, which is sort of like the mysterious one that your paper is about. Now, we're talking about the first commonplace one. You kind of pointed out, I mean, it's not so commonplace to say that it's because of nous, intelligence in connection to Anaxagoras, right? But I think the more, anyway, so it's like a little bit confused. Like there's like, it seems like in the first stage, there's a couple. I don't know where to put the nous type of explanation is what I'm saying.
Oh,
But
so
I mean, it's pretty obvious that like when it comes to the first type of commonplace explanation, like saying I grew because I got more flesh. Like that's a kind of very intuitive sort of commonplace explanation.
most scholars will read that passage and say, aha, that means that Plato rejects any type of explanation that incorporates matter or sensible particulars as an explanatory mode. He's just against becoming. Everything is about being. Becoming cannot play a legitimate role in an explanation, and that's what these scholars say. And I think that it's not because he doesn't reject mechanistic explanations because they have to do with nature. He rejects them because they don't guarantee the effect, right? And so what's interesting is later on in the dialogue, he says, the reason the water flows back and forth is because it has neither, it doesn't have a resting place, something like that, right? So he's explaining why water flows in a stream, and he's appealing to a sensible particular, water. So he can't be against explanations that involve particulars altogether.
Right. Okay. Okay. Yeah. And because in your interpretation of this third type of explanation, the Clever Αιτία kind of explanation, you're going to bring in your interpretation, you think Socrates is willing to explain things using, on the one hand, a little bit of forms, and then the second like ingredient is sensible particulars. Good. Okay. So, well, maybe let's talk then about the second type of explanation that comes up in the autobiography. the one that appeals only to forms. Because this one, it looks like, it's not including sensible particulars. So can you kind of flesh out what's going on with that type of, it's part of the second sailing. What's going on with that type of explanation?
Socrates' discussion of the safe idea is extremely exciting because you could argue it's the first time that he is describing the theory of forms that is so central to Plato's metaphysics. So we can use Helen as an example. Helen is beautiful because she participates in the form beautiful. What's distinctive about that, the innovation there, is that rather than appealing to Helen's hair or her perfect teeth or whatever, those things don't guarantee beauty, because you might think Helen is beautiful, but Jack might think she's not, right? So you can't appeal to physical characteristics as guaranteeing beauty. But if you participate in the form beauty, that is both that secure, that guarantees that you are beautiful, right? To a certain extent, it doesn't guarantee that you're maximally beautiful, but if you're beautiful, if you participate in the form beauty, you have beauty as an attribute.
Right. So it fits that guarantee. It's like I was kind of thinking, okay, so, someone might think, oh, I'm hurting because I got kicked in the back. But, some people get kicked in the back and they're not hurting. So that doesn't guarantee that being kicked in the back doesn't guarantee you're hurting. However, if you participate in is there a form for pain? I don't know. If you participate in the form pain, I guess that's going to guarantee that you're in pain. Okay. And so that's kind of his, I guess it's sort of like a revolutionary new thing that Socrates, it seems like obviously it's like a kind of bizarre explanation. It's because it seems like not super helpful in a way to be like, oh, Helen's beautiful because she participates in the form beauty. But yeah, that's the second type of explanation that's on the table. And then your article is about this third one that he proposes, which he says it's more clever, right? That's right. So yeah, can you tell us about, okay, what's this more clever explanation?
So he says, now I can give you the type of explanation. I can say that a body is hot not because it participates in hotness, but because there's fire in it. So before we could, with the safe idea, we had fire is hot because it participates in the form hot. But now we're talking about things that carry with them certain attributes, when they're in other bodies, right? So Socrates is ill not only because he participates in the form illness, but because he has a fever. So I think the best way to wrap our heads around that is to think about how what I call the metaphysical interpretation reads that passage. So according to the metaphysical interpretation, fire participates in the form fire, and the form fire entails the form hot. So that's why fire is hot. So in the metaphysical interpretation, they're positing more forms. Instead of just the form hot, they have the form fire, which has this necessary connection to the form hot, such that everything that participates in the form fire also then, as a consequence, participates in the form hot.
So we have a fire, it's hot, and we want to explain why. Are we trying to explain right now why it's hot? Or what would we? Okay, so we want to explain why is this fire hot? And the safe explanation, the second kind, would be to say because it participates in the form fire?
No, the safe explanation would say that the fire is hot because it participates in the form hot.
Okay. And then the third type of explanation, instead of saying it's hot because it participates in the form hot, it's going to say it's hot because
Because it has fire, or it is fire.
it is fire. Okay.
And according to the metaphysical interpretation, fire is hot because fire participates in the form fire. And the form fire has this necessary connection to the form hot. So everything that's a fire must also be hot.
Let me make sure I get the Plato's argument right. So the first type of explanation, is it safe to say that the natural scientist like Anaxagoras is just listing necessary conditions, and Plato's critique is really, a bunch of necessary conditions are never going to get you to an adequate explanation. For instance, if you want to explain the birth of a cat, it's not an explanation to say, well, the parents are alive and they're also like in that location. You have to have some sort of cause that guarantees that effect. Mm-hmm.
Sometimes a sort of commonplace explanation, it doesn't even identify something necessary, right? Because like the one that I just gave about, okay, I'm in pain. Why? I got kicked in the back. Well, I could be in pain without getting kicked in the back. So it's not even really necessary.
Yeah, and the best example of that is when Socrates says, the reason I'm sitting in jail, if you look at the passage carefully, he says, the reason I'm sitting in jail is because the Athenians thought it best to condemn me, and I thought it best to obey. Sure, I couldn't be sitting in jail. I couldn't be in a seated position if it weren't for my bones and sinews. But those same bones and sinews could have brought me to exile in Megara, right? Like bones and sinews themselves don't guarantee that I'm in this jail. And they're not the reason I'm in jail.
Yeah, that's really good, because Lloyd Gerson, in his characterization of this argument, he cashes out in terms of the opposites there. And so if you have one condition that could lead to different, contrary things, like Socrates being in jail and not being in jail, then it can't be an explanation of one phenomenon. It's sort of arbitrary that you choose that to be an explanation.
Excellent. Very well put. Yeah, I agree with that. That's really helpful. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then he moves on to the second type, and we've covered that. I think that's a pretty good summary of that. So now we should, definitely get into your fever example, because that's doing a lot of the work in the article.
A fever participates in the form fever according to the metaphysical interpretation, and the form fever entails the form illness. Now, with the clever explanation, Socrates is ill because he has a fever. So Socrates has a fever, so he participates in the form fever, which entails the form illness, so Socrates is ill. But that doesn't quite work because the fever itself isn't ill. Socrates and the fever have the same relationship to this very same forms in their entailment relationships. So shouldn't the result be the same, right? Here's another example. The word for fever is more accurately translated as excess heat. Okay, so I participate. So if there's excess heat in my body, I have a fever. But excess heat we can't say that the form excess heat entails the form illness, because my oven has excess heat and my oven is not ill, right? And so here's the point, that forms are eternal, unchanging. And so the relationships among them must be necessary. And Vlastos, one of the proponents of the metaphysical interpretation, goes so far as to say the laws of nature for Socrates are just as necessary as logic, in the same type of necessity as get in logic and mathematics.
So it seems like, is there like maybe two problems going on? So basically, we're laying out the metaphysical interpretation of the third type of explanation. And you've kind of are now touching on, your criticisms of it. And the first one, which is super interesting, is that it seems like there's a sort of random or arbitrary asymmetry where fever participates in the form fever. And according to metaphysical interpretation, that entails participating in the form illness. But we're not running around saying that the fever is ill.
Right.
So we have a fever that's participating in form 1, fever, and then form 2, illness, but we're not running around saying it's ill. And then on the other hand, we're supposed to be saying that the body sort of through the fever, it's a little bit confusing. Like the body is, thanks to the fever, participating in the form fever, and then, because I guess it has a fever. Anyway, but at any rate, the body is participating in the form fever and thereby the form illness. And we are saying the body is ill. So we're saying the body is ill, but we're not saying the fever is ill, but they're participating in the same forms. So I mean, there's like this asymmetry. It's like, why is there that difference? But I guess maybe the main problem is more it violates the conditions for an explanation, right? And right, because it would be like, or I don't know. Is basically, so far, does that sound about like right, Betsy, or
Absolutely, Sam.
Okay, so there's that kind of problem, but then also I think if I'm right, like you're kind of pointing to like almost a second problem, which is like, hold up, there's not even an entailment relation. Because you're pointing out my oven can have excess heat, but it's not ill anyway. So that suggests, in effect, it's like the oven is participating in the form fever, and it's not, right? So maybe that's like a kind of a second issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, do you want to like talk any more about? I mean, I think that criticism is pretty strong. I don't know what we would say in defense of the metaphysical interpretation, but you do have some other kind of points against it, besides its difficulty with handling the fever example. Do you want to talk about any other criticisms of the metaphysical interpretation? I think one of them has to do with like the soul.
Socrates, the whole point of the Phaedo is not just to say that the soul is alive, but that the soul quickens the body, the soul enlivens the body when it enters it. So that, now if the soul were to enter a human body, it would enliven that body. Participation in the form soul and even participation in the form life doesn't explain the causal interaction, the effect, the way the body is changed by the soul. I mean, the soul is not just alive. It has this power it also has a power to enliven, right? And I mean, another objection that I raise is that the soul only enlivens things when it enters mortal sentient bodies. If you put a soul in a clay pot, that pot is not going to become alive. Now, the reason that's important is because the forms, because they're eternal and unchanging, they cannot explain, in my opinion, they cannot account for counterfactual conditionals. So, for example, if a soul is in a body, a human body, then it enlivens it. Oh, but wait, if the soul is in a clay pot, then it doesn't. Right? That complicated explanation, or that principle. I mean, we today are fine with it, right? The law of gravity, if I drop something, it will fall unless it's a helium balloon, right? Like we have these if-then statements, these conditional statements in the laws of physics and the laws of nature, and we're fine with it. But the Plato can't do that because the forms can't support that kind of explanation.
Okay, so yeah, this is super interesting. So like, it's one thing for a fever to have the power to make a body ill when it's in that body, but it's another thing for the fever to itself be ill. So obviously, a fever is not itself ill. Instead, a fever has this power to make the body ill. All right, and then going to the soul. The soul, it has this quality of being alive, but that's like a different thing than it having the power to make a body alive when it's in it. Now, you point out that, like you just said, it's like, well, if you put a soul in a clay pot, it doesn't make the clay pot alive. Whereas if you put a soul in a body, it does make it alive. And if that's true, then it can't be that the forms are capable of explaining the fact that a soul can make the body alive. Because if it was explaining it, then it would just, if it's in a, it's a little bit, it's like the soul participates in the form, so it's alive, and thus it, if that was alone capable of explaining these powers, then whenever it's in anything, it would bring life to it, right? But you're saying actually, when it goes into a clay pot, it's not making the clay pot alive.
I think what's going on, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you have X, and X it does guarantee this effect in a lot of cases. But then we have cases where it doesn't guarantee that effect. And so we have to have an additional component Y to account for, why X is not doing this in other cases. And that's the whole counterfactual thing. And so that means that the explanation has to include both of these elements, not just, the form in this case.
Excellent. Yeah, I agree with that.
But Betsy, so like one thing I was wondering is like, are we sure that the soul is not going to make the clay pot alive? What if someone of the metaphysical interpretation just said, look, the soul maybe can't go into a clay pot, but if it could, it would make it alive. Yeah, so I guess I'm wondering is like, they could be like, no, look, anytime if the soul's alive, that means whenever it's in anything, it just immediately entails that whenever it's in anything, it makes it alive. And so, yeah, if it could go into a clay pot, it would make it alive, but it just turns out it can't go into a clay pot.
The important point is, and you mentioned this earlier, that the ability, so with fire, for example, the ability to ignite objects is not the same as the property of being hot. So if I have a fever, I'm hot to the touch, but I can't light the candle that's on my desk. You know what I'm saying? Right? So that's why I emphasize that the soul's ability to bring life to the thing, to the body it occupies, is distinct, is not the same as just saying simply that the soul is alive.
Yeah, with the ability to make something hot. Like something can be hot, but not be able to make something hot. So that suggests, in general, just by participating in the form hot, you don't get the power to make other things hot. Excellent. Necessarily.
Right.
And so, I mean, okay, so maybe let's then go to like kind of implications of that. Because like, so one kind of thought is like, I don't know, if like people like certain Platonists, or I don't know, maybe a lot of Platonists, but I'm thinking of like Eric Pearl. He's a contemporary Platonist, and he wants to say, look, absolutely everything, when you think about sensibles, everything about them is reducible to forms. There's absolutely nothing about them And so he will even say that like a sensible thing is just an appearance of a form, because it's like everything about the thing is reducible to forms. But your point, I mean, it seems like you're saying that there's something about things that are not, it's not reducible to form. So for example, the fact that a soul enlivens the body, not only is alive, but enlivens the body, you can't reduce that to a form. I mean, would you say that? Would you say, so, okay, so I guess one thing I'm wondering is like, what do you think about the implications for like the broader Platonic metaphysics? Because like, I'm thinking in Platonism, it's like, we start with a bunch of, we start with the one, and then we go down, we get a bunch of forms, and we're just going to use those things to explain absolutely everything. But it looks like, oh, that's going to explain certain sort of stuff, like the soul being alive, but it's not going to explain these causal powers. So I don't know. Can you just, what do you think about all that?
Well, I agree with everything you said, and that the forms can't account for causal powers. But I think that's a good thing for Plato, because, I mean, Plato himself, in the Parmenides, for example, criticizes his own theory of forms. There are problems in the theory of forms, and the theory of forms is not necessarily the same in every dialogue, right? So I think that's good news for Plato, that there's an irreducible cause, an irreducible phenomenon or explanatory mode that cannot be attributed to the forms. Because now, look at his theory of explanation as a whole. Now he can go to the Timaeus and explain why the cosmos is the way it is, without having to rely exclusively on forms or the divine or the demiurge, right? I guess my point is that it enhances his ability to explain things. It enhances his theory of explanation. It makes it more nuanced. And so I think it's a more charitable reading of Plato.
So, we have certain qualities that can be explained in terms of forms, like Helen being beautiful. Then we have other qualities that can't be explained in terms of forms, like the causal power of the fire being able to actually ignite that wood. Now, it would be a problem if it's like there's no explanation of those causal powers, right? Like what if it's not in terms of the forms, like like why? What do you think would be like the idea behind, like, why is it that wood that fire can? Where does it get that causal power? Why can the fire ignite the wood if it's not the forms?
The more complicated answer is that if you look in the Timaeus, I've argued that the traces of the elements the pre-elements in the pre-cosmos, you can't explain the ability to heat things in terms of fire's participation in a form. It would be it would be great if Plato's theory of forms could account for the types of phenomena that we've been describing, like the soul having the power to enliven a body. That would be super cool. That would be awesome for Plato. But I just think that the forms are too limited. His theory of forms is too limited to go that far. So I definitely agree that you are strong because you participate in the form strong. But that's not enough to explain. But so is Jack, right? Jack is also strong. But you can break a board in half with your hand, but Jack can't. Let's say
it's actually the reverse, but no, I'm just kidding. But you agree though that so I'm with you. It's not enough, but part of the explanation of the causal power, right? It's going to somehow have to include my participation in the form strength.
Yes.
But like you said, it's not enough for sure. Yeah. So I'm wondering whether it's like the extra bit is the relations among the particulars.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah. It's just interesting. I mean, it makes me think of Edward Halper, his work. He talks about like that's the lacuna. He has like this whole like theory of like, you know, he's a Aristotle scholar, but he has this whole theory of like the development of Western philosophy. And he's kind of like the thing that the Greeks had trouble with were relations.
So if we were to take, I mean, this could be maybe another criticism of the metaphysical interpretation. If we were to take the example of the strength, and we just say, oh yeah, the form of strength is sufficient to explain. Well, as you pointed out, you can explain why Sam can break the board and I can't by appealing to the same thing. So again, you're proving two contraries with the same explanation, and so the explanation fails.
Exactly. Yeah. Very well put.
For the last question here, Betsy, like, I mean, when it comes to your hybrid explanation, so this is the reading of the third type, clever explanation. You know, you reject the metaphysical interpretation for the reasons we've been describing, and instead you put forward the hybrid. And it's hybrid because in this type of clever explanation, we're going to involve, on the one hand, the forms, but on the other hand, sensible particulars. Yeah.
Yeah, as an irreducible component of the explanation. That can't be reduced to just relationships among forms. Like that's the stopping point of the explanation. So there are forms and then there's sensible particulars, and those sensible particulars cannot be explained in terms of forms. They are the stopping.
This is really good because, like Sam, you mentioned earlier, Pearl's reading of Platonism and Plato, his system. And for Pearl, I mean, we've talked about this before, you and me, but he seems to think that there is no role in Platonic metaphysics for sensibles. But I mean, here, it seems like there has to be a role if you want explanation at all.
Exactly. This has important implications for the Timaeus in particular, right? Not just the Phaedo. But I don't know how you can understand or read the Timaeus if you think that everything is explainable, in terms of forms, right? It just wouldn't work.
Betsy, thanks so much for coming on. Your article is absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's like obviously super important for thinking about Platonic metaphysics. So thanks so much for writing it, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.